Welcome to this video where you will learn how to install and use the SPHN Connector tool. In this presentation, we tackle the installation and general use of the SPHN Connector. Please keep in mind that once installed in a given environment, the data given to the SPHN Connector for conversion does not get sent anywhere outside that environment. Every functionality of the SPHN connector run on the data gets processed inside the environment where it is installed. The data stays in the local environment and therefore does not get transmitted or processed in any cloud or external environment. There are two possible ways to install the SPHN connector, either with Docker in a rootful or rootless mode, or with Podman only on a rootless mode in this case. The choice of the container tool depends on your organization and existing infrastructure. For the remainder of this tutorial, we will be focusing on installing the SPHN connector using Docker. Before installing the SPHN connector, make sure to fulfill the hardware requirements, which are a minimum of 16 GB of RAM, 4 CPUs, and 500 GB of disk space. In addition, the following prerequisites must be met. Make sure to have an internet connection. The SPHN connector is run locally, but the installation step requires that you access the Git repository of the SPHN connector. Therefore, you must also have access to Git, and you must also have a Docker and the Docker Compose plugin installed on your machine. For installing the SPHN connector with Docker, the steps presented in this slide must be done. We will now do a live demo of the installation steps using a terminal. In the terminal, clone first the repository. You can specify the version you would like to use. Here it's 1.5.2 that we want to install. Once the repository is in, you can go into that one. You can have a look at its content. Then the first thing to do is to copy the configuration file into your local environment. So this .m file. Open this newly copied file. You can see now that this is the configuration file for the connector. It contains some mandatory parameters to fill in, like the data provider ID that you must provide, and some other logging accesses for tools that are being used in the connector or that you can use in the connector. And you also have some optional parameters that you only need to worry about if it's of relevance to you. For the sake of this presentation, we are adding some dummy credentials and saving this file. Then you can run the setup command, which will install the tool. This may take a couple of seconds or minutes if you have never installed the connector before or that version specifically. Once the installation is done, you can run the docker compose up command to start the container. And once the container is running, you can go to a browser, type in the URL bar, the localhost, followed by the port number, and then you reach the SPHN connector with its different services, with the API doc, some of the tools being used, and at the bottom you can see the documentation. Now, reaching the API, you come to this page. The first thing you have to do is to authenticate yourself. So you have to enter the username and password provided in the configuration file when you install the SPHN connector. You can now use the API. Then you can create and configure your project. The project configuration space is where you can specify and manage the different projects for which you need to convert the data for. When creating the project, you have to give it a name. Then you can also specify the data provider ID if it is different from the one you have given in the configuration file during installation. Then inform about the RDF format the project wishes to receive the data. Check the other options and tick as needed. You must at least provide the SPHN RDF schema, and if applicable, a project RDF schema. Then you can click execute to run the process, and once the project is created, you receive a response. Here, the test project is successfully created. Next, you can upload other relevant external files like shackle rules or external standard terminologies that are derived in project-specific schemas, for instance. And once these initial steps are done, you can focus on the main part, which is how to get your data into the SPHN connector. There are 5 ways to ingest the data: RDF, JSON, database, CSV, and Excel. For all the ingestion possibilities, templates can be obtained with the GET method, templates to which your data must comply when sent to the SPHN connector. After fitting your data, you can upload the files using the appropriate ingestion method. You have the possibility to ingest file one by one or trigger a batch ingestion to load multiple patients' files at once. For a batch ingestion, enable it by switching the Boolean value to true. When triggering the batch ingestions, the files are being added to the MinIO storage bucket used in the SPHN connector. So you can trigger the batch ingestions with this method. The patient files must be uploaded one by one, and the ID of the patient must be given in the appropriate field. After patient files have been ingested, the processing step can be triggered. In this step, the data gets checked, possibly de-identified, integrated, or transformed into RDF, and finally validated. These steps will be detailed in a follow-up training. You have the possibility to monitor also data processing steps, and patient files can be downloaded in RDF as well as some additional reports. Finally, the SPHN Connector API allows flexibility in user management. For more details, we recommend you to read the comprehensive documentation on the SPHN Connector's installation and the user guide. They contain precious information about possible troubleshootings users can encounter. Thank you for your attention.